During World War II, nearly 50,000 Italian prisoners of war were imprisoned in the United States. Shortly after Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September 1943, many Italian POWs swore allegiance to the United States and were formed into Italian service units. This is the story of one such ISU located at the Letterkenny Army Depot outside of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania.
La dichiarazione di guerra è già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori di Gran Bretagna e di Francia.
The bravery of the Italian soldier was very practical. I mean, when they needed to fight, they fought as well as they could and as well as they had been prepared. The equipment in particular was substandard to what they were facing. So it really brings in an interesting point. You know, even with that, they fought.
And they were doomed to fail. It wasn't that they weren't courageous. It was more that they were ill-equipped and logistically they weren't supplied. They were starving. They had no food. They had no water. They were out of ammunition. There's nothing left to do but surrender.
Last week, we saw the ill-fated invasion of North Africa by the forces of Italy in 1939.
The Italians become allied to the United States, and so they are being shipped out of North Africa, Sicily, and they're being brought into the United States as prisoners of war.
And there were times when it was very difficult for them, as they would sometimes have to eat food from that had been thrown away. And he mentioned that he had found jars of jelly in the garbage somewhere, and he was just eating that with his fingers. They were so hungry.
They came here as prisoners, and now 80-something years later, commanding officer of the same location they were at is of Italian heritage. So I think that's just part of the whole American dream, right? You can come here wherever you came from, however little status or money you had, you can rise up. It's just the American dream, right?
They were here for roughly between 17 to 18 months. That's it. Here we are almost 80 years later, and we're still talking about the Italian service unit.
It seems so obvious now that what we have here is very special, and it's not just a Chambersburg story or Franklin County story. It's an American story.
Nestled in the hills of south-central Pennsylvania is the town of Chambersburg, a town that encompasses a rich history which began over 200 years ago. After a 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh, the team arrived to begin filming. Once you arrive, you'll see Chambersburg is no ordinary town. It is the home of Letterkenny Army Depot, a sprawling base with beautiful scenery and an important mission. However, it was also the home of roughly 1,250 Italian soldier prisoners during World War II. As the team finally pulls up, it's here at the famous Letterkenny Army Chapel that our story begins.
If someone comes up to you and says, I heard there's something about Letterkenny, and you said, give me the elevator speech. What's the elevator speech about this whole thing?
In 1944, a contingent of Italian prisoners of war came to Letterkenny and provided assistance to the United States government, especially the United States Army, and had an experience, a lived experience that was extraordinarily positive for both, well, for the command, the U.S. Army command here, the local civilian populace, and also the soldiers. It's such a positive experience. When you think of the great controversies, when you just look at the U.S. home front during the war, you know, you've got Japanese internment and the tragedy of that. This is a story that is positive because of the outcome, the way that they experience, the POWs experience being treated, the help that they gave to the U.S. command, and the interactions of two cultures coming together, and these two different cultures blending. And in memory, and down through the generations, this story has been passed down. And the interest is there to make sure that it's honored.
Audio rolls. A is rolling.
B, roll. C is rolling. Go ahead on set.
Let's start with Letterkenny itself. You know, when we were coming in here, we see this base in what would seemingly be the middle of nowhere, but yet it's kind of a strategic importance. Let's talk about Letterkenny and why was this base built and why is it here?
Well, the story, I think, goes back to Pearl Harbor. So here we are, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is attacked. Within 2 weeks after that, the War Department orders that about 20,000+ acres of land is purchased to build a support depot. They select Chambersburg in Franklin County as the location. Beautiful, pristine farmlands, agricultural. A lot of history goes back easily to the 18th century. And so that's how this begins. But I think there's another story that's connected that I want to touch on just for a moment that is very important. When the Department of Defense, the War Department, decided that it wanted to build this depot here in Chambersburg, it was looking for a place that I think today you would call it an inland port. So it's close enough to Baltimore, close enough to Philadelphia to reach the seaports. The rail lines were running between those locations, so products could be packaged and shipped out of here, and in time, equipment, weaponry could be brought in and retrofitted and shipped back out to the war zone. So we were essentially, we became a depot that supported Europe and the war-fighting effort, and that's still the case today.
The selection back then, and as is now, was started off with mostly just a location. So it's very accessible to rail waterways and pretty close to D.C. And then the bigger part, which I think is really important now, It's just the people of the area. You have people in the area that are just used to working with their hands, and you know, so drawing labor from the local area was you know, a little easier than it might have been in some places, because you have people that are they just used to doing their own, building their own houses, you know, working on their own cars and all that kind of manual hand labor. That skill set was really important to what they were going to do once the depot was established.
Of the 20,000 acres, there were about 1,000, 1,100 people that lived in this valley that ultimately became Letterkenny Ordnance Depot initially. And we're talking about 250 families. We're talking about 8 schools, 5 stores, 5 churches, 8 cemeteries that were in this valley area that the government stepped in and took over essentially by eminent domain. So here we are in the middle of December 1941, and the government declares, because of the war effort, and they needed to move quickly to build this installation, you need to be out by April 1st, 1942. And that's exactly what happened. The farmers were displaced, and the depot started construction on that date. Now, you can imagine that the significant emotional event of those families being displaced, and a lot of young children that were growing up, generations since the 18th century had grown up here, and now those 250 families had to leave and find other employment, other farms. That was, at that time, pretty tragic in terms of how people felt about that. But the silver lining, as the writings describe to us, over time, say over the next 3-4 decades, those children grew up and gained employment here at the depot as it grew. And the older the parents took jobs in many cases here. And so the writings say that the people in the long run appreciated the economic benefit of what ultimately took place.
Because of the rail lines and the proximity to the coast, it made the depot the destination for supplies and material to support the Allied war effort in Europe. So there was a big need for labor, which was one of the main factors in converting these Italian, former Italian POWs into labor battalions. Letterkenny at the time, because of most of the men of fighting age were serving overseas. Letterkenny, about 55 to 60% of the workforce here was actually women at the time, called women ordnance workers. So there was a desperate need for labor. Letterkenny was a prime choice for one of the Italian service unit to be designated here.
By 1943, those Axis powers forces, the Italians specifically, become allied to the United States. Mussolini is gone, fascism is, they're no longer under that umbrella. And so they are being shipped out of North Africa, Sicily, and they're being brought into the United States as prisoners of war. So even though the Italians, Italy was allied to the United States by the fall of '43, the War Department, the State Department, did not recognize Italy as allied for another year. So it was really October of 1944 before that was accepted, before that was announced to the rest of the country that this was in fact the case. So now these Italians are coming in here starting in May of '44, and it still hasn't been acknowledged, but they're coming in here starting in '44 into the United States. And about 1,250 of them from Italy get sent here to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, to Letterkenny Army Depot. And so where this chapel currently sits was right in the middle of a prisoner of war camp. Now, there is a fine line because those Italian soldiers were part of a country that's allied to the United States, no longer aligned with the Axis powers. They were referred more as soldier prisoners of war, and they were treated very, very well. And all of the accounts that we have tell us that they were fed and clothed and cared for medically, and their time off, and they were paid 80 cents a day. They were cared for better than any other type of prisoner of war experience, you know, internationally and nationally.
My name is Frances McAvoy. My father was Alfred Tonolo, and my mother was Tina Norse Tonolo. Mom was from Berwick, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from here. My father was born in Mestre, Venice, in 1920. Eventually, during World War II, he was captured in Tunisia on May 11th, 1943, by the British. They had gone through the soldiers had gone through many hardships, the hardships of war, as you can imagine. And he was actually grateful to have been captured by the British because they were not cruel.
When the Italian POWs first entered the United States, they were sent to various locations around the country to be counted and sorted. Many soldiers remarked about how glad they were to be in the United States, far removed from the awful fighting conditions in North Africa and Sicily.
He actually was so happy to have a bed to sleep in because he had been sleeping on the sand for several years in Africa. He was happy to have a bed to sleep in and a shower and a bathroom, and the place was relatively clean. And so he showered and dressed and went to the mess hall, and he was just astonished at the amount of food there was there. So he took his tray and he went to get his food, and the chef who was giving the food out asked him, "How do you like your eggs?" And this was a guy who had been a prisoner of war. I mean, he's a prisoner of war now, but had endured all these hardships of war for several years. And now here's an American soldier who was asking him, how do you want your eggs? He was dumbfounded. He was astonished and so grateful. And he always told that story about how grateful he was to be here at Letterkenny.
The day in the life of the Italian service unit was waking up quite early, roll call. They had their assigned guards with them that would do roll call every morning. They would go over to the chow hall, the mess hall, and then load up onto buses to be taken to their work assignments. Part of that was that they're able to make 80 cents a day supporting the Allied war effort, which in today's dollars is about $14 a day, which doesn't sound like much, but there were different times when the ISU would pull together their earnings and support various causes. One example is that there was a U.S. bond drive going on the depot towards the end of 1944, and they were able to raise over $300 for the bond drive, the ISU unit was, and in today's dollars, that's over $6,000, which is a really great effort on their part. There are different times when the ISU unit would pull together their funds to send back home. There's one instance when one of the servicemen received a letter from home saying how bad off their family was, that they had family members that were killed by the Nazis, that they were trying to help the Americans. They had little to eat, no money. So the unit here raised funds to send what they could home to try to support that Italian serviceman's family. Whenever the Italians arrived here, there was some trepidation by the community as to not quite sure how to receive the Italians. Because just a few months ago, they were combatants. They were the enemy. They were over here because they were POWs captured in North Africa.
And what was very hard to understand for an American, and it makes sense, this way of treating Italians was way over the top, too kind, that they were coddling. In other words, why are these POWs, prisoners of war, being treated so well when they were holding their rifles and throwing grenades, shooting and throwing their grenades at their kids? How is that possible? So they were very upset with and not understanding what this program of cooperation meant. And that's the summer of 1944. The military then command really through decrees and programs at the War Department began to help local commands, in particular the depot command here, to face that, to have outreach to the community and explain what was going on.
They did not know how to accept the fact that there were Italians here living off the fat of the land, per se. They were receiving 3 square meals a day, had quite easy jobs, what they thought there would be easy work to do. But they soon found out after a couple public meetings that it was not the case. So what happened early on is that the commander at the time, Colonel Hare,
he went out and briefed the civic organizations, the veteran service organizations, to say, look, this is who they are. They're part of a country that's allied to America, and they're working hard to support your sons and daughters that are overseas, and they're making it possible for us to accomplish the mission in a very efficient fashion. And I think as a result of that, everybody sat back and said, oh, well, we didn't really understand that.
While maybe somewhat uneasy at first, really created a bond with the Italians that were here.
And I think over time, because the prisoners, the Italian soldier prisoners here were allowed in escort, I think they were in groups of 30, they could be taken downtown. They had opportunities to go to performances in town, to dances, to observe parades, and they met other people from the community and established friendships. And, you know, that also extended to men meeting women of the community, falling in love. Eventually, after repatriation in October of '45 back to Italy, they came back and took wives and got married here. Some of the women here went over to Italy and got married there to some of the soldier prisoners that they had met while they were here. So the community really, I think, embraced the Italian soldiers. And of course, this edifice has become a very important piece of our culture, our history. And it links us as Americans across the ocean to Italy, and they to us. And I think that's an important part of this story.
The soldiers here actually had relatives and friends that lived in the United States already, and the friends and family came to visit them quite often. So that's how my parents met. My mother was, as I said, from Berwick, which is not too far from here, Berwick, Pennsylvania. And her family her friends and family knew some prisoners of war at Letterkenny. So they invited her to come take a ride with them and come to visit. And my father then was introduced to my mother, and they fell in love here at the Letterkenny Depot. And they were able to see each other on several occasions while he was here, before he returned, before he got sent back to Italy. They had this strong love for each other. My father didn't know how long he was going to be unable to return to America, and it turned out to be 4 years, because there was a restriction on Italian immigration after the war. Italians weren't allowed to come back to immigrate to America. So my parents corresponded by letter the old-fashioned way, for 4 years. And they finally made plans to marry in Venice. And my mother and her sister, her older sister, who was her chaperone, sailed on the Queen Mary and arrived in Venice. And that's where they were married in a lovely, lovely ceremony.
During their time at Letterkenny, the men formed strong relationships with the local community. Some of those relationships were even romantic, and after repatriation, some of the men and women stayed in touch and ended up marrying and starting families together. However, there were some instances where families were unable to reunite, leaving many with unanswered questions.
Scianini Antonio mi ha parlato appunto di questa situazione che ha avuto lui andando a Letterkenny ed è stato avvicinato da questo Ronnie Hyde, che sentendolo parlare, essendo italiano, lui si sentiva italiano, si è avvicinato a loro, mi ha detto che si è commosso, piangeva in continuazione e ha abbracciato appunto Antonio Brescianini, e lui insieme a altre persone gli hanno promesso di interessarsi a questa storia di Ronnie, che in effetti è un figlio di un prigioniero che è nato dopo che suo padre è stato rimpatriato. Quindi magari il papà non sapeva neanche che con la signora che era stato insieme era incinta e quindi ha partorito poi. Comunque sta di fatto che questo ragazzo è stato prima tenuto dalla nonna per qualche anno e poi messo in orfanotrofio e adottato successivamente da un'altra famiglia. È chiaro che nelle famiglie dopo si inizia a parlare di tu non sei mio figlio, il mio vero figlio, noi non siamo la tua vera famiglia, e lui ha saputo le sue origini.
There was always a story in our family that Ronnie's father possibly was one of the Italian POWs, but it was like a secret. No one would talk about it. So the more I saw things in the paper, the more I just felt a pull that I needed to come up here to the celebration. And when I did, that's when I talked to Dr. Perry and Antonio Bresciani, and things started moving forward from there because I do work on the family history and the family genealogy. My father and Ronnie's mother were brother and sister, so that's where the connection was. But Ronnie wasn't raised by family. My mother tried to bring him back into the family, and when I was a teenager, she came to me and told me she wanted to take me to his house to meet him and his wife. And so then we started trying to get him back with our family where he belonged. So like I said, I like to do genealogy, and my mother always wondered who his father was. She wanted to know, and so I started doing the research, and I think it probably was within a year or two after Letterkenny that I had Ronnie do a DNA test, and lo and behold, because the rumor that was out there, lo and behold, the DNA test showed that he's 50% Italian. So we knew we had our answer. We started, the DNA matches started rolling in after he tested with Ancestry. He actually has, I wrote it down, he has like over 2,400 DNA matches on his paternal line, more than I do on mine. But a lot of the matches, there are certain names that kept popping up, the same similar names. And what we came up with was one of the POWs who was from San Anastasia in the Campania area. His family still lives there. He had 9 children. The DNA matches run back to his family. But his name is one that was listed on the list of POWs. Then I was on a Facebook site, and someone told me to private message them. They had information on the family, so I did that. He said he would do some research. He researched, and he told me the POW's parents' name, and it was that other name that kept popping up, that his mother had that last name. And so we had the 2 names finally that we narrowed it down. So we think we know who it is, but until we have someone go to the records office or until someone does a DNA test, then we'll be 100% positive.
In America esiste appunto Ronnie High e spiego questo qui, che avrebbe il piacere di conoscere senza nessuna pretesa, vuole conoscere i suoi familiari. Dice sì, va bene, io appena torno a mio marito vi faccio sapere, vi chiamo. Questo è successo 10 giorni fa. A tutt'oggi non abbiamo avuto nessuna telefonata, non sappiamo nulla, non sappiamo se insistere. Io ho detto ad Antonio, adesso l'unica cosa che ci resta da fare è andare dal vescovo, magari il vescovo di Aversa, che conosco, e il vescovo di Nola della diocesi napoletana. Si possono incontrare, fare qualcosa di fare in modo che i familiari si incontrino e poi tutto il resto verrà da sé.
Well, I'm 77 years old. I'd like to know who my dad was. People don't understand that. Those boys, I'm glad they got a dad now, and they know who he is. I never know, and I still don't know. That's tough.
Really interesting aspect of the Italians is this unit was very talented in building things, especially masonry work that was discovered to then lay the groundwork of the recreation building, which was built, and then ultimately the Letterkenny Chapel.
U.S. War Department plans to build the chapel and bell tower had been formalized by December 1944. But many in the Letterkenny community believed the actual impetus for undertaking the construction began with the attempted suicide of one of the detained Italian soldiers. This story still animates the facts surrounding the most important material symbol of the Letterkenny POW experience.
The commander at the time, the very first commander that started in, April of 1942, he would check the barracks every night. And one night, a near tragic situation occurred where he came upon one of the Italian soldier prisoners of war, and that person was committing suicide or attempting to commit suicide. He stopped that. They administered medical care, and he asked that individual to be brought to his office the next day. And so in the conversation with that particular soldier prisoner of war, he asked him, well, what did you do in Italy? And he said, well, I was a stonemason. And the commander thought and said, well, you know, we don't have a chapel here, but could you design one? And the prisoner said, well, I can design it and I can build it. And so the way that evolved is that the building next door to this chapel was built in about 30 days by the Italian soldier prisoners of war. And they used that temporarily as an assembly hall, as a place to hold religious services, mostly Catholic, and to have other types of meetings and social events. But they started building this chapel, and that was in December of 44. In January of 1945, they started building this chapel. And the way they did that is they designed it, and they went out into this 20,000 acres, and many of those farmsteads that were torn down, they picked materials from those buildings and brought them back and built this chapel from those remaining materials, from old mills and houses. So most of what we see in this chapel are original materials from those farmsteads. Now, the chapel was built in the space of about 5 months. They finished it, started in January. Of course, that's kind of the coldest time of the year here. And they finished it in May of that same year. And one of the things that the government said was, well, we have a mission to perform. And of course, all of those Italian soldiers were also brought here to handle the need for labor. They could only work at night because of that mission support that every day and supply and transportation elements of the depot. And if they needed materials like mortar, they had to pay for it out of that 80 cents a day, which of course at that time went a lot further than perhaps it does today. And they did that with great joy, and that really provided them with a morale opportunity to be gainfully employed. And along that same line, and I think because that soldier was despondent and tried to commit suicide because he had heard that his wife had died in Italy. That was the main reason that occurred. But taking on the responsibility of designing and building this chapel gave them a purpose.
All of the soldiers, a lot of the soldiers who could participated in the construction of this chapel. They were all very happy to be able to do that because most of them were very religious. They came from a Catholic background and they were very religious people, and they loved the idea of having a chapel here. And so they were very proud of it. And the bell tower was the big thing.
Corporal Smith properly described the Italians by saying, "When one finds 3 Italians who have stopped in one place for more than a week, one will also find a small coliseum after they left."
I think because it's actually so incredible what they were able to accomplish in such a short time with such little resources. So, I mean, you have a bunch of folks who were prisoners of war. Now, all of a sudden, they volunteered to support the Allied efforts. And a lot of the structures that are, some of them still in place today, were built just from, whatever resources they can find on the depot. And if you just look at the chapel, for instance, and the great stonework on there, just I think the artistry and the skill that they had and the passion that they brought, because under the circumstances they were in, it's not easy to just not only work all day long, but then at the end of the day, put some extra time in on your own after you work 10, 12-hour day to build something else that now still stands in this community 80 plus years later.
Arrivederci.
Ok, grazie per tutto. Ok, vogliamo avere una conversazione. Ti chiederò domande. Prima domanda, come si chiama?
Antonio Brescianini. Mio papà ha combattuto nella ritirata di Al Alamein, che sarebbe del Nord Africa, ed è stato catturato dagli inglesi nella piana della Tunisia.
E poi dopo è stato consegnato agli americani.
E poi portato negli Stati Uniti d'America.
Sì, mio padre mi ha parlato della guerra, di tutta la sua esperienza, quindi i ricordi della guerra e dei combattimenti erano ricordi molto aspri, molto duri, molto crudi.
E mi ha raccontato, diciamo, lui non era proprio nelle prime linee, era nelle seconde linee, quindi mi raccontava, diciamo, l'epilogo della guerra che in Africa, perché mi diceva che di giorno era notte e di notte era giorno dai bombardamenti, e loro si trovavano molto spaesati da questa situazione perché non avevano abbastanza mezzi. Quella guerra specialmente fu una guerra dove divise anche l'Italia in due fazioni, cecchi erano un modo, cecchi erano un altro, quindi quella guerra in particolare dall'Italia non voleva essere combattuta da nessun fronte. Tant'è vero che gli italiani si trovarono prigionieri degli inglesi e prigionieri dei tedeschi, quindi non avevano identità.
La cosa che più l'aveva colpito è stato l'arrivo a Letterkenny, che era dimagrito moltissimo per le ritirate che aveva fatto e non potevano mangiare perché avevano lo stomaco chiuso.
Poi però è cambiato tutto, nel senso che si è accorto che lì poi lo trattavano molto bene, e anche se lavorava e lui diceva che lavorava per le ferrovie, credo che facesse le traversine delle ferrovie, però aveva anche molto tempo libero. Un aneddoto che mi ricordo che quando ero piccolo, che lui diceva che lo trattavano talmente bene che mangiava le bistecche con le forbici, perché erano talmente grandi che uscivano dal piatto, cosa che in Italia, dove abitava lui, la carne la vedevano forse a Natale una volta, per cui questo voleva dire che stava bene. Poi, quando è tornato in Italia, poi ha conosciuto mia madre e quindi non è più ripartito.
Questa è stata un'esperienza che lui caldeggiava molto come esperienza umana di amicizia sua personale con i suoi commilitoni, prigionieri, e con gli americani, quel battaglione che avevano formato gli americani di questi prigionieri. È stata un'esperienza di scambio umano e di amicizia. Questa è stata una bella cosa.
Racconta questo periodo come periodo di salvezza, non solo dalla guerra, ma dalla miseria, dalla fame, è stato curato, è stato accudito, ha imparato l'inglese, ha fatto 2 anni di scuola per cui conosceva anche la lingua inglese. E raccontava che per la prima volta aveva visto i mezzi agricoli che in Italia non c'erano, almeno paese di mio padre ancora non c'erano, e dice che la manodopera era soprattutto femminile e loro aiutavano.
Lui dell'America in generale, perché è stato anche in altri posti prima, e quando parlava sembrava un bambino che parlava del paese dei balocchi. Io lo ricordo così, mio papà.
E quando lui parlava, ad esempio, delle immagini che aveva visto negli Stati Uniti, da noi in Italia ancora non c'era la televisione e quindi non credevano a lui.
Per cui dal momento in cui dopo la guerra ricordava lo sviluppo che c'era in America e che non c'era in Italia. In Italia, quando sono ritornati i nostri prigionieri, dopo la guerra era un'Italia in miseria, povera. Per cui ricordava sempre questo aspetto ed era da stimolo per mio padre, facendo gli esempi con gli americani, ma soprattutto il rapporto con gli italo-americani, che andavano a trovarlo nella prigionia. Lo parlava sempre di questo.
Mi raccontava, lui faceva il meccanico prima di partire militare. Poi, mentre faceva il militare, è scoppiata la guerra, allora l'hanno trattenuto e lì è stato fatto appunto prigioniero, e penso sicuramente lui avrà fatto lavori di meccanica. Infatti lui parlava che era rimasto impressionato perché noi nella campagna lavoravano ancora la terra con il bue e con l'aratro, e lì diceva che c'erano molti campi, molte macchine. Lui faceva manutenzione a queste macchine da prima, non a Letterkenny, e non si faceva niente a mano, facevano tutte le macchine, e per lui era andato in un altro mondo. Poi invece di Letterkenny parlava, diceva più che altro del rapporto, lui parlava che si era creato, per lui erano tutti fratelli.
Poi mio padre, essendo un musicista, ha trovato altre persone che erano musicisti e hanno formato questa banda dove loro facevano ballare i civili che intervenivano nei sabati o comunque quando avevano accesso i civili, o comunque suonavano la musica per intrattenere le persone. E gli stessi che hanno costruito la cappelletta, sempre lavori di muratura a un altro livello, avevano fatto anche l'anfiteatro, un anfiteatro dove loro suonavano e la gente interveniva, ascoltava la musica e ballava.
Che per mio papà, vabbè, era molto legato alla chiesetta, ma lui soprattutto era un musicista. E vabbè, la storia della chiesetta, come ha detto il presidente, era legato a questo soldato che si stava suicidando, eccetera, eccetera, quindi è nata la chiesetta. Però loro hanno creato poi la banda, che mio papà chiama la banda dei Galli. E qualcuno invece dice Pollassi, vabbè, io ho un appunto dove parla dei Galli, e quindi c'era chi cantava, chi suonava, lui suonava il violino, e quel violino che vi ho portato è proprio quello che è arrivato dall'America poi, che si è portato a casa.
Questi erano i suoi ricordi. Non aveva aspirazioni musicali, non aveva aspirazioni architettoniche, non sapeva fare il falegname, era uno di buon umore che viveva questa esperienza come una cosa positiva che gli era capitata nella sua vita.
Sì, mi raccontava tantissimo. Mi raccontava che lui lì guidava il camion, infatti questa è la patente che gli hanno dato a Letterkenny, quindi lui portava tutto quello che c'era da portare nel campo. Non mi ha mai detto il nome, penso perché non lo ricordasse forse, però mi raccontava molto spesso del periodo lì, si è trovato molto bene, anche perché per pura fortuna vicino c'aveva una zia, quindi molto spesso usciva, andava dalla zia, aveva le cugine lì, quindi si è trovato molto bene lì. Ha contribuito anche alla chiesa portando tutto il materiale che c'era da portare con il camion, quindi lui è diciamo, sempre stato un autista di camion, quindi era la sua passione, quindi lui era molto fiero di aver guidato anche lì e di aver dato il suo contributo anche lì.
Sì, mio padre ha parlato molto della sua prigionia a Letterkenny Ha parlato molto del cardinale Cicognani e aveva la sua bella piantina dove vedete che ha scritto la chiesetta della pace. E la cosa più importante è questo foglietto che forse ha aiutato poi il grande Brescianini a trovare una parte di noi.
Mio padre voleva trasmettere la sua storia e ha cercato in tutti i modi di trasmetterla. Non è stato molto ascoltato e io sono felice di essere stata contattata dall'ANPIL nel 2015, sono stata rintracciata e attraverso l'ANPIL io spero che le storie di tutti e quindi anche della sua storia venga raccontata dappertutto, in tutte le scuole e in tutta Italia. Quelli che vogliono ascoltare.
Però l'ho perso che ero ancora giovane, avevo 18 anni e non ero molto interessata ai suoi racconti.
Allora, mio nonno era piemontese e quindi era una persona molto riservata, di poche parole. Ha lasciato un diario in 2 parti, ha parlato molto poco della prigionia e questo è un po' un mio scrupolo, perché mi sono chiesta, sono io che non ho fatto domande o è lui che non ne voleva parlare? Quello che ha raccontato, più che altro del suo lavoro, perché era falegname e quindi che era molto apprezzato dagli americani, e addirittura quando era a Letterkenny gli ufficiali lo portavano nelle loro case private per fare dei piccoli lavori di riparazione, dei piccoli mobili, e lui era orgoglioso che apprezzassero l'abilità italiana, artigianale italiana.
Mio nonno, se fosse ancora vivo, vorrei avere tanti particolari e tanti ricordi della guerra, di quella che è stata la sua cattura, le vicende in Africa, e sono tutti quei particolari che si possono apprendere solamente nel momento in cui tu li vivi. Per esempio, lui aveva questa devozione verso la patria, verso la libertà. Come ho già detto, era in contrasto con le idee fasciste.
Allora, io vorrei che mio padre parlava poco, però l'umanità e il fatto forse di aver condiviso con tante persone un periodo di vita particolare, brutto, lo ha spinto ad aver fiducia negli altri. Mio padre non aveva nemici, non ha mai parlato male di nessuno. Il fatto della comunità, di stare insieme, per lui era un valore. E questo spirito, infatti anche quando tra donne si parlava, lui non voleva pettegolezzi, voleva la coesione e forse l'ha imparato in questo periodo di difficoltà.
L'associazione ANPIL è nata sul viaggio gli americani, ci hanno chiesto nel 70° anniversario della costruzione della cappella di Letterkenny la possibilità di una delegazione andare in America. E in questa delegazione siamo andati 23-24 persone, fra cui c'era anche Carlo Borghetti, che abbiamo ricordato prima, e in vari spostamenti con il pullman, con il bus, è venuto fuori questa idea di Carlo Borghetti di fare questa associazione che raggruppasse un po' come ramificazione di tutta Italia il collegamento, e da lì la bellezza di questa associazione è che gli stessi figli, femmine, maschi, dicono che questo ricordo, questa memoria è come se avessimo riscoperto ancora la memoria dei nostri padri, e tanti confidano che vanno a cercare nelle soffitte, nelle cantine, nelle seconde case, foto, documenti per ricordare questi avvenimenti. Ecco, l'associazione è nata proprio per questa memoria.
È l'associazione che è nata, come ricordava Antonio Brescianini, che è l'anima dell'associazione, perché senza di lui non ci sarebbe, dobbiamo dirlo, l'associazione, che ha chiamato direttamente ognuno di noi facendo riferimento, e ricordo benissimo la sua telefonata quando mi chiese: ma lei per caso ha dei parenti che hanno fatto la guerra là, sono stati prigionieri? Sì. E allora da lì è nata questa amicizia incredibile, però l'anima è Antonio Brescianini.
Questa è un'esperienza straordinaria perché non mi è dato da capire, da sapere che non esiste un'associazione che ha raggruppati tanti soci, ma anche figli di prigionieri. La nostra associazione, siamo in contatto con circa 593 per l'esattezza famiglie contattate, e la ricerca verso i comuni di tutta Italia va avanti per cercare i familiari di questi prigionieri per rendere questa memoria. Per cui mi piacerebbe insieme a tutti voi andare avanti in questa ricerca per lasciare questa memoria, perché è un ponte che lega prima di tutti noi, ma anche verso l'America, è un ponte di fratellanza e di unità.
Avere costituito un'associazione ci consente di poter girare per tutta l'Italia e forse in futuro anche fuori dall'Italia, contattando le istituzioni, i comuni, le regioni, dove poter portare la nostra mostra, esporre i pannelli e quindi ampliare la conoscenza. Vorrei che l'associazione venga sostenuta anche da quelli che non sono i figli o i parenti dei prigionieri italiani a Letterkenny, ma anche da altri che si possono unire a questa associazione e portare avanti questa memoria. Come nel mio caso, io non sono un parente, ma mi sono unito a questa storia perché è molto importante e molto bella e voglio contribuire a farla conoscere sempre di più.
Anche a me piacerebbe che venisse che ci fosse questa memoria perché fa parte della nostra storia, delle nostre radici, ricordare quello che hanno vissuto, perché a me personalmente, quando mia figlia andava a scuola alle elementari, la maestra ha detto: chiedete ai nonni se hanno fatto la guerra e dove hanno combattuto. E quando mia figlia ha detto che il suo nonno era stato prigioniero in America, la maestra gli ha detto: ma chi ti ha detto queste stupidaggini? Come fa tuo nonno a essere prigioniero in America se gli americani erano i nostri alleati? Chi ti ha detto queste cose? E ha mandato a chiamare me cosa stavo dicendo a mia figlia. Io ho detto: guardi che mio papà è stato prigioniero in America, e lei non voleva crederci. Allora io mi sono stupita che una maestra, un insegnante non sapesse queste cose, cosa era accaduto. E secondo me invece è importante far conoscere queste cose.
E se io dovessi dire alle generazioni di adesso cosa fare e come parlare dei prigionieri americani, vorrei che questo fosse fatto nelle scuole, perché nelle scuole in Italia dei campi di concentramento in America non ne sa niente nessuno. E questo io l'ho scoperto perché quando parlo con i miei amici, con i miei conoscenti, dicendo che mio padre è stato prigioniero in America, si stupiscono tutti. Credevano che i campi di concentramento fossero solo in Germania o in Inghilterra, e nessuno sa dei campi di concentramento in Germania. Per cui vorrei che nelle scuole italiane si parli molto di più anche di questo fatto storico che conoscono in pochissimi. E quindi questa sarebbe la mia speranza per poter far riconoscere a tutti gli italiani quello che hanno passato mio padre, ma a tutti anche quelli che sono stati prigionieri negli Stati Uniti.
Spero che l'associazione venga conosciuta sempre di più per fare conoscere sempre di più questa storia, soprattutto alle giovani generazioni. E mi piacerebbe che l'associazione domani possa andare a parlare nelle scuole, incontrare gli studenti che hanno poca memoria e che non sempre a scuola imparano tutto quello che riguarda il nostro passato. Noi siamo figli della nostra storia. Se non conosciamo la nostra storia non possiamo avere davanti strade giuste da percorrere.
La memoria storica è questo che è importante sia per le persone come mio zio che hanno partecipato a questo conflitto, che hanno sofferto soprattutto, per esempio dei 680 carristi, solo 22 si salvarono illesi e vennero imbarcati per gli Stati Uniti. Quindi mi diceva, bisogna ricordarlo, bisogna avere quelle ambizioni positive affinché i nostri ragazzi, tu, tuo cugino, dobbiate sempre portare nel mondo questo messaggio di pace.
Vorrei che appunto la gente sapesse che con i loro sacrifici ora godiamo di tutte le libertà e tutto il resto e aborriamo le guerre, perché le guerre non sono mai buone, portano solo distruzione e morte.
Non è facile, loro si sono sacrificati ma l'uomo non capisce mai, infatti guardate in che situazione siamo adesso e quindi di sicuro mi direbbe l'uomo sta sbagliando ancora e non è servito a nulla il nostro sacrificio, però dovremmo appunto continuare con queste testimonianze, con queste associazioni proprio per insegnare ai nostri figli che però c'è il modo per vivere senza guerra.
Quindi questo spirito comunque di fare qualcosa per cambiare ci deve essere nei giovani, non accettare tutto perché tanto è così. Il messaggio è quello, fare qualcosa, perché i nostri genitori in queste situazioni, nella guerra, nella prigionia, comunque sono riusciti a costruire, a uscirne fuori e a tirare avanti il boom che c'è stato in Italia, lo dobbiamo a loro, non a noi.
Fare memoria è molto importante, perché noi dobbiamo evitare di ripetere gli errori del passato. Questa storia ci racconta gli errori della Seconda Guerra Mondiale, gli errori di avere fatto una guerra. Purtroppo abbiamo tante guerre nel mondo oggi, quindi vuol dire che purtroppo non siamo capaci di ricordare i nostri errori e di evitarli. Ma quella storia ci aiuta anche a capire cosa c'era di buono in quel momento. L'amicizia tra i prigionieri, l'amicizia tra il popolo italiano attraverso quei prigionieri in America e il popolo americano. E quindi organizzare quella memoria è fondamentale per poterla tramandare meglio in futuro.
Allora, quello che io vorrei dire è questo: se dopo quasi 80 anni si parla ancora oggi di queste gesta, opera che i nostri padri sono riusciti a fare, non so, e a tramandare nella memoria dei ricordi degli americani, tanto è vero che voi siete qua. E questa è una cosa molto bella e credo, io ho sempre sognato che di questa fantastica pagina di storia si facesse un film documentario e il sogno si è avverato, perché credo che i migliori film avvengono proprio delle storie vere e questa è una storia vera, molto bella, che sicuramente va tramandata anche ai posteri.
I had been captured in North Africa after 3 years of fighting in the desert. We had been on many American army posts doing manual labor. Now, in 1944, we were sent to Letterkenny.
Mio padre si chiamava Amilcare Mazzantini.
Volpi Renato.
Francesco Longhitano. Peranito
85 years later, and you still have families, descendants of these men, coming back to America to see where they lived and worked, and the structures they built is a huge testament to how important it is to their families.
Mio papà si chiamava Mario Garbagnati.
Alfonso della Russa.
Di mio nonno Francesco Romanello.
Giovanni Appi.
When they came into this chapel, you could have heard a pin drop. And while they were here, they hugged and they cried and they sang and they laughed and they took pictures. And suddenly, those many miles from Italy to the United States, to Chambersburg, Franklin County, suddenly that gap was closed.
Mio papà si chiamava Antonino Falanga.
Si chiamava Carlo Scalmana.
E mio padre si chiamava Dilio Gobbino.
Giovanni Barbè.
Severino Convito.
Di Pasquale Cirillo.
Ma quella storia ci aiuta anche a capire cosa c'era di buono in quel momento. L'amicizia tra i prigionieri, l'amicizia tra il popolo italiano attraverso quei prigionieri in America e il popolo americano. E quindi organizzare quella memoria è fondamentale per poterla tramandare meglio in futuro.
Mio papà si chiama Raimondo.
Vitto Giuseppe.
Mio nonno si chiama Pietro Bracchi.
Nicola Cudemo.
Mio padre si chiamava Savio Cavagna.
How did the Americans treat you? They think that's wonderful reading. They were so good that we just couldn't believe it. After working all day, they would come at night to work on the chapel. It is still here. It is an army chapel now. It is like a symbol, a beautiful symbol of friendship between the people of Italy and the people of America.
To see the good that was here in this horrific point in our history, in the world history of humanity, this incredible catastrophe of the Second World War, that there was positive good that came out of this because people were open to cooperating and coming together. That's the legacy. And the legacy continues today through children, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, understanding the importance of that lived experience that their uncles, great-uncles, grandfathers, fathers had.
This story came to you how? I remember you telling me the story of how things came together. So did this exceed your expectations, or what did you get out of this the most, I would say?
No, that's a great question. I was first exposed to this over a year ago by an older gentleman who's passed away, and Giuseppe D'Andrea. He became a mentor of mine. In fact, I met him when I first started learning Italian, and I wanted to talk to native Italian speakers, and I was a member of a community. He said, "Oh, you should talk to Joe," and just became friends over the years. Just became friends. He would help me with my Italian, but he would tell me stories. And I grew up in Pittsburgh, and this Chambersburg story is 3 hours from here. I never heard of it. As you read their stories, these guys went through a lot, and it wasn't good. And so finally coming to America was almost like, all right, you've had enough. Yeah. I'm going to give you a break. And they were lucky, in a lot of ways, they're very lucky to come to America. So as I'm reading the stories and meeting the family members, like when we went to Milan, you're telling them, they're so passionate, like, you don't understand what it tastes about my father. And then you read the father's diary, their notes, and you're like, my God, I had no idea about all of this. And that was the biggest thing, was they opened up from the heart. They opened up to all of us. Yeah. They invited us in. They
trusted us
with their stories, with their emotions.
With the emotions, especially.
Exactly. Personal information, personal photos, love letters, everything. They held nothing back. So this is the story. And so as I got to know this, it far exceeded my expectations, because I just thinking it's a chapel. What's the big deal? These were prisoners. Hey, they had it pretty good. Then you start digging in and realizing, they had it good for that 18 months, but there was a lot going on before that. And by the way, they had to go back. And going back wasn't the greatest experience.
Once the war was over.
Right, because Italy wasn't prospering. It was like one of the family members even says, it was miserable. They were poor, they just got out of a major war, they were bombed, a lot of people were dead. It wasn't a good situation. See, in America, when the war was over, we sort of went back to business as usual. These countries at the end of the war, they didn't go back to business as usual. They're digging at the rubble.
They didn't have that return to normalcy.
Exactly. And now these prisoners who'd been away for 4+ years, maybe 5 in some cases, now they go back for the first time and they see what's left. You know, am I going back to my town? Is it going to be there? Or my relatives going to be there? And so that was tremendous. And in fact, one of the diaries was very profound in that regard. And I got to read it from beginning to end, you know, and it starts with his experiences in North Africa. And again, they're not good. They're getting bombed, they're getting attacked, they're trying to surrender, they're marching in the desert, you know, it's just miserable. And they're put on ships, they're being sent here, they're being sent there, and then eventually they finally make it to America, and specifically to Letterkenny. Now they're in Letterkenny. Hey, life's not so bad, I can't believe this. But then they got to go back. And what I loved about his diary was one of the few that said, so what happens when I get back? And we were actually very fortunate enough to interview his son, who actually read the diary. And that was when I read the diary, and you guys recall, I said, before we even filmed one frame, I said, this is how it ends.
Yep.
Because we got to let people know, at the end of the day, they made it.
Yeah.
Like a journey for us, we made it. And so they made it.
Allora, 29-10-45. Alle ore 7 alzatomi, bevuto un po' di caffè e andato al posto di blocco, che poi con 3 macchine alle 11:30 è giunto a Montagnana. Dopo una mezz'oretta ho incontrato Esterina, che era la fidanzata, poi zio e papà, poi avanti un poco ho incontrato la mamma, zia Maria, Gelmino, tutti i parenti, insomma. Alle 15 è entrato in casa, fine, e qui è finito il diario.
Sono senza la mamma, sono qui prigioniero, questo suolo straniero mi tormenta ogni dì. Salvami, Madonnina beata, alla casetta tanto amata, voglio un giorno ritornare. Se potessi volare, scavalcare il confino, da mammina e babbino, vorrei un giorno ritornare. Salvami, Madonnina beata, alla casetta tanto amata, fammi un giorno ritornare.